Hello, my dear students. Welcome back to GIT335, Computer Systems Technology. Today in the lecture we will be covering Chapter 4, Hardware, the CPU and Storage. This chapter and its material are very close to my heart because the things that we will cover in chapter this week are the fun nuts and bolts of the computer and the technologies inside of it that make it work. So our topics will include processing, the system unit, microprocessors, and main memory. And Unit 4B will consist of secondary storage. Processing, the system unit, microprocessors, and main memory. So we talk here about the very most basic part of a computer would be the transistor inside of it. You've probably heard that the first computers had giant vacuum tubes that constantly had to be replaced. The vacuum tube was the predecessor to the transistor, and basically the vacuum tube on those old huge floor-sized computers would either contain a vacuum or it wouldn't. So the computer would create vacuums inside of the vacuum tubes, and the tubes that had vacuums in it would constitute the different functions keeping track on its fingers and toes while it performed calculations. So now vacuum tubes have obviously gone away, and instead we have transistors that have gotten so very small, but they serve the same function, and that they also allow the computer to count on in fingers and toes, basically, while they compute. So a transistor is a small electronic gate that is either on or off. It is basically either a 0 or a 1. And when it is a 1, there is the presence of energy, and when there is a 0, there is an absence of energy. And so a transistor, which have gotten down to microscopic size, is what has allowed the computers to get so small these days. So anyway, there's a picture of a vacuum tube here, and then you can also see, it says here that transistors have replaced vacuum tubes. A circuit, as we briefly discussed, we are going to discuss connecting your keyboard to your computer. A circuit is a continuous connection of energy between one thing and another in your computer, and then when a button is pressed or something is changed, that circuit is broken, and the computer knows that something is different than it was a few minutes ago. So, for instance, the power button on your computer is connected to the motherboard, and there is a consistent series, a circuit of power connecting the power button to the motherboard. And until you press the power button, that circuit is uninterrupted. And once you do press it, it realizes there's a break in that circuit and that it's supposed to perform some function. Here we are, more about transistors. Transistors are integrated circuits in that they are embedded onto a single silicon chip on the computer's motherboard. An integrated circuit is solid state, which means that it has no moving parts, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the upcoming slides. In that modern hard drives, or rather the hard drives that are pretty much on their way out at this point, are not solid state, in that they have moving parts inside them. They have giant platters of reflective magnetized disks that contain positive and negative magnetic charges throughout them. And those maps are indexed, and the data stored on each one of those giant platters is held in the computer's memory so that it knows where to go and find and retrieve and store data. But a solid state hard drive has no moving parts, and so you've probably heard that solid state hard drives boot up in seconds, whereas a non-solid state mechanical hard drive, like most of us still kind of use, take much longer to do that because those platters have to move to the proper places and get up to speed and whatnot. So like I said, we'll talk about that very soon. Silicon. Silicon is a substance used in computers. Certainly you've heard about silicon processing and perhaps even wondered why it is so important to computing. And the reason is because silicon is a semiconductor in that it is a partial conductor of electricity. It is critically important that the inside of your computer, that the electricity is not either grounded or that is perfectly controlled, because it has to completely move around the motherboard without being hindered in any way. For any reason, when you're installing a motherboard, if you ground the motherboard so that the power can escape anywhere, it simply won't work. So the power system is a very, very delicately balanced structure inside of the computer. And so a semi-conducting silicon backdrop is the perfect thing to place all of these electronic components on. So that's why a semiconductor is such a prevalent term. It's because computer parts are built on top of them. perfect underlayer for highly conductive complex circuits, and microchips are made from semiconductors, partially good conductors of electricity. And then a chip is a tiny piece of silicon that contains millions of micro-miniature integrated electronic circuits. So we talk here about the theme of miniaturization, and you probably remember in the first lecture we touched on Moore's law, and Moore was a mathematician who predicted that computers every 4 years would be halved in size, they would be halved in cost, and they would be halved in terms of their processing, or doubled in terms of their processing power. So that they would get smaller, cheaper, and faster every 4 years. That would double. And he's been absolutely right, and that's why it came to be Moore's law, in that he very correctly predicted that theme, that trend. And so you see here now when we talk about computers, we have a smartphone or an iPod or whatever that is, because it's a computer at this point. It's a smaller but perfectly effective computer, in that it has a CPU, absolutely, and it has many, many of the other parts that you would find inside of a full-sized computer inside of it as well. So yes, our small mobile electronic devices, due to miniaturization, do qualify as computers. So here we have a system unit of a big boy, one of these ancient dinosaur desktop computers. And then we also see a laptop and what appears to be a tablet, Microsoft Surface perhaps, and then a lineup of smartphones. And as we said, each of those are computers, in that they perform computing functions. Representing data electronically. This is a very interesting subject. So as we have already discussed exhaustively, your computer can only understand zeros and ones, which is kind of akin to working out a code with your significant other where you're in a room together and using the light switch to turn the lights on and off again. You devise some kind of a code in which you can speak together and communicate information to each other simply by the state of the light being on or off in the room. That would be a two-state binary system of communication. So the very same way inside of your computer, the binary system is strictly zeros and ones. And like we talked about, when the computer reads information out of memory, it either finds the presence of energy in that transistor, in which case it computes a 1, or it finds no energy there, in which case it computes a 0. And with the only exception being quantum computers, which are coming on the scene before too much longer, which are exponentially faster at processing and performing computing functions, binary systems are the only method for processors to crunch and communicate or process data. So yes, as we say here, so these are interesting. As we talked about, one bit is 1 on or off, 1, 0, or 1, and then a byte is a collection of 8 of those. So you see on this slide, the G character is represented by 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. And then the R is 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0. And so each letter is a collection of 8 bits to form 1 byte that represents that letter. So then we talked here about measuring capacity. And once again, all data is represented as binary. A bit is either a 0 or 1. A byte is a group of 8 bits. A kilobyte, K for kilo, is 1,000 bytes. A megabit, M for million, is 1,000,000 bytes. Gigabit, G for billion, I don't know, you tell me, it should probably be bigabit, but a gigabit is 1 billion bytes. A terabyte, as we talked about, is we are finally in the terabyte age, in that you can get 1 to 4 terabyte hard drives, and that we should expect throughout the course of our lifetimes that hard drives, if they continue to be relevant, we'll probably see petabyte size hard drives, because the data just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that we now have massive video files, we now have massive audio files. Our image files, if you work on high resolution images, can be very, very, very large. And so I have a terabyte hard drive on my work computer, and it's full of stuff. And then I have a backup 2 terabyte connected to it, and that thing's full. So I recently had to get a 4 terabyte drive, and I'm very, very quickly filling that up. So I'm saving a lot more than just text files. So data, the amount of data that has to be stored and backed up, because you should always back up everything. How big of a nightmare would it be for me if these large video files that I'm recording for this class, if something goes wrong with my mechanical hard drive, and then those are all lost. So you absolutely have to perform a backup of all your critical data. And just because the files are very large doesn't mean that you can't. You always have to back up, always have a backup. Anyway, I'm getting carried away. But terabyte, and then we have petabytes, which you don't hear about very much, and then exabyte, which we may start hearing about in another 10, 20, 30 years. But these are the Groups like, say, the NSA, those are terms that they're much more familiar with in that they process massive amounts of our data. They store and back up massive amounts of our electronic communication. And so those are terms that they would probably use to quantify data. But us, not so much yet. So these are different binary coding schemes, and it's like French or English, different ways to categorize the sounds that are coming out of our mouths and group them as meaningful in terms that have meaning. So ASCII, American Standard Code for Information Exchange, is one way of organizing bits and bytes of data into meaningful bits of information. Unicode is used for, as you can see, it requires 16 bits per character, and that's because there are many, 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 many more characters in Chinese and Japanese. As you can well imagine, I mean, they have hundreds and hundreds of characters where we have 26 letters and 10 digits. EBCDIC is similar, except it's only used for IBM mainframes. Not really specifically terribly meaningful or useful to us for the purposes of this class. That's an older format. Pretty much everything that you will wind up using is ASCII. Your computer probably only has ASCII installed. Here's some more ASCII. It compares ASCII to EBCDIC and the binary coding schemes for those two. As you can see, here's how the different digits are represented. It's kind of interesting if you start over here with 0 to see 0011 and 4 zeros is 0. And then 0011 and 3 zeros and a 1 is 1, and then it starts counting up from there. So you can kind of see, interesting how it builds off of each other. Machine language, binary, is the computer's native language. As we've said, that is the language the computer speaks and understands, and it is strictly zeros and ones. So there is no such thing, at least, gosh, I hope not, there's no such thing as a computer programmer who speaks binary. It is simply beyond our capacity as human beings to read and write and speak binary code. So there are different levels of programming languages, and at the very bottom there's binary code. And at a level above there may be some other kind of machine language that interfaces with binary, and then above that you might have something that's a little bit more like Java or something like that, that communicates with that lower level, that communicates with binary, and then there will be the plain code that you and me are familiar with above on top of that. So there's several different layers between the language that we use to interact with computers and the basic binary that it understands. And then so language translators are system software that converts that higher level language instructions that we kind of sort of speak, and the programmers speak a slightly lower level than we do. And they convert those instructions into data and machine language so that the computer can understand the instructions, what it's expected to do. So you just need to know that there are several different layers, and at the most basic and rudimentary is binary, and as they work their way upwards, they get more and more understandable to people like you and me. So now let's talk about the physical equipment inside of a computer, including but not limited to the power supply, motherboard, and microprocessors. So here are some terms. Bay, we're not talking about Jason Bay, we're talking about an opening in the computer cabinet used for the installation of electrical equipment. That is to say, you can have a hard drive bay, you can have a CD/DVD drive bay, any kind of opening in the computers you can kind of plug in some kind of interface. A power supply converts, when you plug it into the wall, it converts that surge of electricity from the wall into that very, very, very delicate amount of electricity power that the computer is expecting to find. It's very important. So if you're one of those who, maybe you have a laptop and you have an old power supply that's starting to get kind of broken and you can see wires fraying and whatever, you really should not use that, because the job of converting wall power into the very, very, very delicate and perfect balance that your computer expects to find is a very, very important one. And so if you start to see any wear and tear on your power adapter at all, you should stop using it, because instantly all it takes is one bad zzz and it can fry all that delicate equipment inside of your computer. You absolutely do not want that to happen. There's a huge job played by the power adapter or the power supply in converting and maintaining that perfect steady flow of voltage into your computer that it expects to find. So the power supply inside of your computer, we'll see it as a box with a bunch of tentacly things that come out and power the different components inside your computer. A surge protector is something else that I absolutely 100% assure you that you need to use with your computer. And this is something that you plug into the wall in between your computer and the power. You know what a power supply is. A surge protector, excuse me. So a surge protector, if the power goes out in your house, or I don't know, if you're struck by lightning or something like that, even just a moment of a completely screwed up, a huge jolt of electricity can fry your computer. And a surge protector would take that jolt for your computer, it would lay down its life for your computer and save it. So it's very important if you have a computer that you care about a lot, you should definitely use a surge protector with it, because you're playing with fire otherwise. UPS is an uninterruptible power supply, and this is for, if power is lost, it gives your computer, well, it's not really necessary so much for desktop computers, but for servers and very, very expensive high-end mainframe equipment, an uninterruptible power supply, should there be a blackout, there's a battery that's always charged, and it'll take it very, very slowly lower it down to the no power state, rather than just boom, you're dead now, you know? So an uninterruptible power supply is a valuable piece of equipment that you can get if you care that much for your home, but is much more useful in, say, server rooms. The motherboard of a computer is the main system board. You may also heard the term logic board, motherboard, system board are all the same thing. And I gave an example earlier of it being like the map of a town, and then the buses that lead from one place to another would be the roads. But the motherboard would be the map itself. So all the different components are housed on the motherboard, and then there are buses that serve the function of roads with different speed limits, carrying data from one place to another. And we'll look at pictures of those. We're going to have a great time doing this stuff. And then a chipset is a term used to describe groups of interconnected chips on the motherboard that control the information flow between the microprocessor and other critical system components that are connected to the motherboard. You'll see that there are embedded circuits and whatnot on the motherboard, and those all constitute the chipset. Here we are. This is, you'll see there's so many delightful and quaint pictures of computers on here. This is probably a 5 or 10-year-old computer, I would say, in that it's kind of ugly and old right now. Anyway, so here are the different parts. You've got the power supply up in the top right, and I mentioned the yellow and red and the weird colored cables coming out of there. From that power supply, all those different cables come, and as you can see, they interface at each of those different pieces of equipment. You see here we've got the hard drive in a hard drive bay, the CD-DV drive, which is also in the CD-DV drive bay. There's also a floppy drive bay here, and what looks to actually be a zip drive bay also. And the green piece that you can only just kind of see is the motherboard. As I said, that's like the map of the city. And then interfacing with that motherboard, in that it is vertical, horizontally you see a video card, a modem card, and a sound card. Those provide additional function. Typically, a motherboard will have native onboard video and sound, and possibly even a modem. However, the video will be crappy, and it may have, at the very most, like 128 megabits of VRAM on board, and the video card would be significantly more. Traditionally, a motherboard, if you run the native onboard video graphics, it might be enough to power a 1028 by 768, 1024 by 768 monitor, or a little bit bigger, but if you want something really sleek and powerful, suitable for doing big processing jobs or playing video games, you need a bigger video card. And we'll get more into that stuff too. The chip refers to the processor. There'll be better pictures of a processor. But the processor is actually very small, a little square, with pins that lock into the motherboard and interface with it. And then that huge chunk of plastic metal that you see on top of it, that's actually called the heat sink, because it gets so incredibly hot on your processor that the metal is pressed against it with a special kind of heat conductive paste that works to facilitate carrying all that heat away. And then so it creates as much metal surface area attached to the processor as possible so that that heat can be distributed and cooled, because it gets so very hot. Okay, so here's another view of a motherboard and a system case, system unit. As you can see here, this is the Dell Optiplex circa 10 years ago computer case, and that I don't think many of you would be buying these computers anymore, but it serves, they're similar, so we can use it as an example. Similar to what we just saw, as you see here, there's a coprocessor chip starting in the lower left-hand corner. There's the RAM, and as we said, RAM is the volatile memory, in that it loses all of its contents when the computer is turned off. The microprocessor chip is where the processor itself would interface, so that's kind of the docking station for the processor, which is not included in this picture. And then ROM chips contain firmware, software instructions that are built into the computer that tell it how to use and transfer information from one place to another. Here are the expansion slots, as you can see, for video card, sound card, fax modem, etc. And then on the inside, oh, I should have pointed out on the previous slide, everything in the computer is connected by two things. And so if you're trying to identify a component inside the computer, you can rest assured that its function is either carrying power from one place to another, carrying data from one place to another, or it's facilitating in the cooling function. So everything inside of the computer is involved in one of those three things: carrying power, carrying data, or cooling off everything. So you can count on that should you want to investigate the inside of your computer and you want to identify some sort of object. It's one of those three things. So this is another super quaint and near and dear to my heart graphic. This is the inside of what I believe is a Apple G4 tower, and I believe this is the mirrored drive door. In fact, I'm sure it is. This is the mirrored drive door Mac G4. So these are so cute. They have a little handle on the side, and then it opens, and then you can see all the guts. It's so convenient. So here we have the motherboard, and you can see the expansion cards. The hard drive is welded or screwed in real tight to the base there. There's the power supply, and it's so cute, the makers of this textbook. They labeled the zip drive to be a CD drive, but you guys know better. That's not the case. And this is actually one of those really cute Apple-specific zip drives. You can see that little black dot up there is actually an Apple logo. So that's a zip drive, not a CD drive. Don't be confused. So this is a more recent motherboard. This one, DDR2, yeah, this one's probably still at least about 5 years old. But it's better in that, so this one actually includes SATA interfaces. So traditionally, the older hard drives use what's called PATA, and then SATA is a much, much faster interface. So if you look underneath the RAM slots that you see there, there's that little blue box. And then there's also on the left-hand side there, next to the PCI slots there, you can see there's a black one also. Those are the older interfaces for hard drives and disk drives. But if you see over here, the little ones, the orange ones and the red ones, those are SATA. So this is a much faster, a much newer motherboard. And you can also see here, we talked about PCI slots interfacing with the motherboard. But here we see PCI Express 2.0, which is a much, much faster version of PCI. So this is a newer motherboard. And also you could see, once again, we do not actually see the processor. What we see there is the microprocessor interface where the processor actually would go. That's the throne. The king is not on the throne. There's so many other little interesting parts here I'd love to share you, to tell you about. We won't really get into it. But you see there's this structure of 8 little empty holes in it. And then down here there's, I believe that's 24. Those are power. So the power supply interfaces with the motherboard there and there. And I think those are the only 2 places that provide power to the motherboard. Down here you see a little battery, and that's called CMOS, and that powers the functions like your system clock. And that when you turn off your computer, it still continues to count time. And if you think about that, how would that be possible? Because your computer is deprived of power, except for that CMOS. So that little battery provides that trickle for your computer to keeping track of time and other important functions like that. Now what's interesting is it also stores some instructions in CMOS, in that if your computer is not booting for whatever reason and you're trying a lot of different stuff to make it work, sometimes, and this is particularly true with the old Mac computers, they will not boot if the CMOS battery has died. If you have a dead battery on the motherboard, it will not boot. But if you remove that battery, it will boot again as normal, but it won't keep track of time. So if you're playing with old computers and if it won't boot and you're frustrated, not understanding why, just remove the battery, try it again. It's a possibility it'll work. And if you are in that situation and it's still not booting after that, drop me a line because that might be kind of fun to figure out with you. So we're talking about processors here. Traditional microcomputer processors are Intel and AMD. Microsoft. Apple used to have, Motorola used to produce PowerPC processors for them. Maybe you remember it was the transition from G5, Microsoft G5 used PowerPC and Motorola processors, and then there was a jump in I think 2006 or 2007 to Intel processors. And that is the point that Macs began to be able to install and run Windows operating system, because when they used the same computer architecture, the processors used the same architecture, there was no reason that a Mac couldn't install and run Windows as well. So that happened when Macs switched to Intel processors, which is still happening now. PCs have not gone the same way, however. You can't install a Mac operating system on a PC. So we talked about multi-core processors, 2, 4, 6, 8, and it gets up to, like I said, octo-core, which is, it can provide, or pretend that it's providing or processing 8 different things at once, but in reality it's just balancing those things and working on each of them a little bit at a time and doing a slightly worse job. It's not the same thing. A multi-core processor is not the same thing as having 8 processors. It's not the case. It's like a person having 8 brains but still being only one person. You know, they can only execute one thing at a time, even though they can think about 8 different things and hold 8 different things in mind at a time. There's still just that one stream of action. And then we also talked about the GPU, as we said, which is different from the CPU, and that the GPU processes only graphic instructions for shading and rendering images on the computer screen. So because it doesn't have an arithmetic processing unit and it has much less complicated work to do than your traditional CPU, the GPU is many times faster. It is many times faster. And so you'll see on these really high-end graphics cards, the GPUs will be huge, and they'll have giant fans to them because they will go many times faster than a computer CPU can. And that's why, as I said, for that reason, they can try brute force password cracking attempts much faster. They can try combinations much faster. So that's part of the reason that passwords are becoming less viable, in that they can be cracked much more quickly, thanks to GPUs. Processing speeds. Every microprocessor contains a system clock which controls how fast the computer operations can take place. Now, the system clock is a very interesting thing. So inside of the computer processor, there is a very small crystal that is being electrocuted. And as it is electrocuted, it vibrates at a very specific rate. And the higher that they can get that crystal to vibrate, the faster they can make it vibrate, the faster the computer can work. Because each of those vibrations is a clock cycle, is what they call it. And it's the amount of time each vibration can be used to open and turn off a transistor again. So the faster they can get that crystal vibrating, the more instructions the computer can execute, the more times it can open and close the transistor. So an older CPU processing speed is in megahertz. Like, as I said, the first Apple II was 15 megahertz, which is ridiculously slow by today's standards. In that the first iPhone, I believe it was an iPhone 3G, was 550 megahertz. So halfway to a gigahertz already, and I'm willing to bet that the iPhone 6 processor, it's got to be a gigahertz. I'm sure it is. Of course it is. So I would be very surprised if there's not a chance that any computers in operation today that you could buy today new. There's no chance it's running anything less than probably a 2.9 gigahertz, or probably even substantially faster than that. Probably a 4 gigahertz processor would be the cheapest you can buy these days, or the slowest you can buy. However, as I said, the faster the CPU runs, the more power it consumes, obviously, and the more heat it generates. So it's a very important thing to be able to wick away and reroute that heat that the processor creates. If you didn't have that heat sink and that gel firmly in place to help wick away that heat, your computer would fry out very quickly. The processor would just burn itself to death. So the system inside the computer that moves the heat away is critically important. The central processing unit and a machine cycle. So the CPU, as I believe we've already said at this point, is the central processing unit, and it is the brain of the computer. It follows the instructions of the software to manipulate data into information, which, as we said, is the principal purpose of a computer. It takes your data, it is manipulated and by you and the computer, and then it becomes meaningful information. The CPU, as we've touched on, has 2 main parts, the control unit and the arithmetic logic unit, the ALU, both of which contain registers, which are high-speed areas inside the processor that carry data from one place to the other, perhaps back and forth from the CPU to the ALU, but the specific name for those pathways inside the processor is those are memory registers. And these are all kind of linked by the electronic roadway called a bus. And so there are buses inside of the CPU, and there are also buses on the motherboard. And a bus is like a road in magical computer land that takes you from one place to the other. And as I said, there are speed limits. Some buses carry information faster than others. So here we are. Obviously, as it says, this is an enlarged representation, and the processor is obviously not nearly that massive. It would be cool if it was. You could probably take over the world with such a processor. But then, so we see here, the registers are the high-speed storage areas used by the control unit and the ALU to speed up processing. The control unit directs the signals between the main memory and the ALU. The ALU itself performs those arithmetic and logical operations. And in the buses, those electric pathways that carry information from one place to another, just like the city bus does here. And then we have a very, very cute RAM chip there. I say it's cute because there's absolutely no way that those big, that's really old. That's a very old one, but very cute, like I said. And then we have the expansion slats on the motherboard. More about the ALU. It performs the arithmetic functions, comparing data to see whether one is equal, performing the basic arithmetic functions, and then returning the results of those computations to the CPU. And then, as we talked about, registers are the special CPU areas that enhance computers' performance by aiding in the facilitation of data from one place to another. High-speed storage areas that temporarily store data during its processing. They store a program instruction while it is being decoded, store data while it is being processed by the ALU, or store the results of a calculation. So this is memory inside of the computer that will hold information while it's in the processing state. Buses are those roadways through which bits are transmitted, as we've said many times. And then we talk a little bit here about the difference between 32 and 64-bit computer systems. You've probably heard about how now there's Windows 32-bit and Windows 64-bit. And the difference here is the amount of data that can be transferred on those buses, in that a 32-bit word computer will transfer data in 32-bit chunks. And the more faster version now obviously is 64-bit chunks. 32-bit software will run on 64 systems, but 64-bit software cannot run on a 32-bit system. Memory, two types of storage. We have primary and secondary. Primary storage is the main memory, and it is temporary and volatile. This is like the RAM, as we've said. You can fill it full of those temporary instructions, but when you turn off the power, it is all lost. On the other hand, we have secondary storage, which would constitute your hard drive or a flash drive or something like that, anything that continues to hold the data after the power is lost. Explanations of different types of memory. Random access memory, volatile, as we said. ROM, read-only memory, cannot be written on or erased without special equipment. And so this is part of the reason that computer equipment goes bad. If there's an electrical surge or something like that, a ROM chip that contains that read-only memory, those instructions could be lost. And then so the entire piece of electronic equipment becomes bad because those instructions are just gone. So that's one reason, one of the many reasons why it's very important that the proper amount of electricity be sent into your system. And as I said, there's a very, very delicate balance of the electrical signals being moved around. It's important that that delicate balance be upheld. And then, as we said, CMOS. The CMOS is powered by that battery, and that contains time, date, calendar, and boot password. And then flash memory, non-volatile memory that can be erased and reprogrammed more than once. And as we said, flash is solid state in that it doesn't have any moving parts. The cache is similar to RAM, except that it's like RAM for the processor, basically. So cache memory is RAM inside of the processor. Virtual memory is area on the hard drive that has been allocated to serve the purpose of RAM. So it's not really RAM, but we're using computer space on the hard drive instead to serve that function, so that data can be more quickly written to that space and then recalled. And as you can see here in this diagram, from left to right, each type of memory is slower than its predecessor. So CPU is fastest, and then if you can write that to the cache, that would be even faster because then it's like right here. But if it has to write it to RAM, it's a little bit further, and then it has to go back and get it. Virtual memory is even further, and then the hard drive is the furthest by far because it has to find the data on the spinning platters and then retrieve it, save it, whatnot. Okay guys, we're getting there. Expansion cards, bus lines, and ports. Expansion cards plug into slots on the motherboard that are connected by buses to ports that the user can access. Hopefully these terms are familiar to you now. Expansion cards that we've talked about, the network card, the video card, use those PCI Express slots. The buses connect the expansion cards to ports. We've already talked about what the buses are. And then a port is the connecting socket or jack on the outside, which you plug in that peripheral device to. Mouse, keyboard, whatever you have. Expansion cards, that is ridiculous. That is straight up RAM. That is not an expansion card. I don't think RAM qualifies as an expansion card. But anyway, so that's RAM going into a memory slot. Just pretend that that's not on the same slide there. An expansion bus is not the same as a front-side bus. The front-side bus connects the CPU within itself and to main memory, and the expansion bus connects the CPU with the expansion slots on the motherboard and thus via ports with peripheral devices. Slightly different distinction there. Okay, the different types of expansion buses. PCI is the older interface, but is still used for some of the network cards perhaps, or if you have a printer card or something like that. If there's some legacy function that you want to add to your computer that it wasn't initially created with, you'd probably use a PCI slot. So those are included so that you can add older function to your computer now. They used to be the standard, but now as you can see underneath here a little bit, we have PCI Express, which is obviously PCI 2.0, which is much, much faster. And then we have accelerated graphics, which is AGP, and that was a specific type of video card. Even this actually isn't used anymore. They just use PCI Express. But AGP is a faster version of PCI, and so for a while AGP cards were all you could really get for video upgrade. And now we use PCI Express instead. As we talked about, USB is a much faster term or version of serial port. A serial port on your computer is anything that sends data into or out of your computer. A USB is a much, much faster type of serial port. And in the same way, FireWire is the same thing, but it's just a slightly different version of USB. And it was almost entirely, it was used with cameras, digital cameras, and with Macintosh computers. And when USB 2.0 came out, so the older USB, I forget exactly how fast, but the data transport speeds, this is USB 1.1, were not all that fast. And then so when FireWire came out, I forget how much faster. FireWire was 400 megabits per second, which is significantly faster than USB 1.1. But then USB 2.0 came out, which is 480 megabits per second. And so FireWire immediately became not irrelevant, but not nearly as used because USB 2.0 is now faster. And so Macs don't even include FireWire ports anymore. So then Mac answered back by going to FireWire 800, which is 800 megabits per second. But even that's not relevant anymore because USB 3.0 is significantly faster than that. So FireWire is a dinosaur now, and even though it asks you about it here, chances are you won't have to interact with it or interface with it. Serial port, parallel port, USB port, we talked about this stuff. Serial port, as I said, can only send data in one direction at a time, either to or from. Once again, it's the analogy of the old bridge in the country. There's just one direction of traffic at a time, and so you have to sit and wait until you're opening, and then you can go the other direction. The serial port is the same way. Data can only go one direction at a time. Whereas a parallel port, which is traditionally used for connecting printers, external disks, and tape backups, back when tape, like recorded backup onto tape. So as you can hear just from that, I mean, tape is just so irrelevant these days. But parallel ports were used for tape backups. And then USB port is the new standard and is much faster than both of those. But parallel, I should have mentioned, can go twice at the same, in both directions at the same time. Okay, so here we are more with the expansion ports. FireWire, as I said, was more meaningful probably 3 or 4 years ago. Ethernet is, as you know, for exchanging network traffic. Graphics, connecting digital monitors and multimedia digital devices. eSATA, even this is kind of going away. It's probably not going to be on the test, I would say probably not, but it's just not as fast as USB 3.0 anymore. So when it came out, it was really relevant for about a year or two, and then USB 3.0 came out, and why does anyone need another USB 3.0 works with USB 1.1 and USB 2.0, so eSATA, you don't need specialized cables and stuff for it anymore. Bluetooth, as we said, up to 30 feet is the best way to send something without wires. It's not necessarily wireless transmission. But if you're within 30 feet, Bluetooth is the fastest way to send something without wires. IRDA is, maybe you've seen that, the red light that kind of comes out of the back of your computer or something like that for sending a digital signal through that red laser beam. And so there's a special cable that sends that red laser in an unbroken format, maybe to your stereo's receiver if you have a digital connection or something like that. HDMI, high definition multimedia interface. So this is obviously one of the newer standards for carrying both video and audio. HDMI carries both at the same time, as you may be aware of. And for that reason, it is a very intuitive and easy to use and fast transmission of video and audio data. So it's used with the TVs today and even with computer monitors. However, one drawback with HDMI is that they have this thing called HDCP, and you might have come across it before. It stands for copyright protection. And so HDMI sometimes does some wonky things with connections. Like if you try to, it doesn't want to create the handshake sometimes with, you might have experienced this problem setting up a TV or a computer monitor. Sometimes it just straight up won't work. And that's because there's some kind of copyright protection with that HDMI signal. So if you're having trouble with anything like that, just Google HDCP and maybe you'll be able to figure out what's going on there. MIDI, we talked about MIDI. That's a very, very old standard used for plugging in musical instruments. So if you had a piano and you wanted to record it in GarageBand or whatever, you would need a MIDI interface and a MIDI card for your computer. Here is another diagram of the back of a computer. And so we have here, this is, like I said, this is another old one, except there is some relatively new stuff on here. So here we see the modem port. That's the kind of thing, like seriously, no one would need that anymore. So that's kind of a giveaway that this is an older computer. And then we have what is obviously a TV tuner card. It's got two coaxial ports on it. So if you wanted to run television into your computer, that would be an upgrade card that you could have, a video in card, and then you could also take that video signal out using coaxial. And then I can't tell, I think it has a network card after it. In fact, I'm sure it is. So that's for wireless. And then next to that one, the far rightmost PCI card is a video card. And as you can see, it has the white DVI, which is DVI stands for Digital Video Interface. And underneath it, the blue one is VGA, and the A stands for analog. So obviously, whenever possible, you want to have that digital signal. So VGA is older, DVI is newer, and then we have the different ports. The Ethernet port, USB port, and then there's two USB ports, and underneath it, they didn't even bother to label it, but that is a FireWire port. On the far right there, we see the PS2 connections, purple for the keyboard, green for the mouse, and then next to it is that it looks like a composite. If you see the red, white, and yellow on the far left, that is known as composite, and that is how video and audio are carried. The yellow carries the analog audio or video, and then the white and red carry the two channels of analog audio, left and right channel. So then far on the right, that is also a composite, except that is a digital input. And so I believe that would be called SPDIF. Anyway, so that's digital composite. Here's another picture of the back or inside of a computer. Here is a side of a Macintosh, and you can see there's a closer FireWire. And then DVI, that is actually MiniDVI. So Apple will make smaller versions of the connectors. As you can see, DVI is big and takes up a lot of space, and Mac, to keep things small, created MiniDVI. So that should be labeled MiniDVI. And this is another example here where I just kind of chuckle at the people who made this PowerPoint slide. They're pointing to a VGA analog graphic port, the little blue thing there, and they're labeling it as HDMI, which is absolutely not the case. So I'm not sure. Someone must have been in a rush to finish these up, because that's just not true. And then finally, we'll talk very, very briefly about secondary storage, online or cloud storage, which is where things are going. And as we said before, but is it really such a great idea to trust the control of your information to people like at Apple or Google or wherever that may really not care all that much about your privacy or the security of that information? It's not nearly as safe as in the cloud, although it may be, in fact, I'm sure it is. It's much more accessible, and it's much more handy to have access to it. So a good example of this would be if you have an iPhone, you can store data on iCloud, and then whenever you turn on your iPad, it grabs that data from iCloud. So it's seamless connection between those two devices. If you're playing an online game on your phone, it'll connect on the iPad. documents, calendars, whatever are stored up in the cloud. But as you might have seen, you can also get into trouble storing your pictures or whatever up in the cloud. Sometimes there was a really horrible movie that was involved with a couple who had some pictures they didn't want to be seen, and then they gave away an iPad, and then those synced up on the iPad, and they went through this elaborate, well, it was just a terrible movie trying to get the iPad back. So that was due to cloud storage. Secondary storage, as we said, is non-volatile. So a hard drive is the primary secondary storage. As we said, this is a mechanical hard drive in that it has those beautiful reflective platters. And then there is the read-write head that magnetizes each of those tiny, tiny, tiny little tracks that are upon the sectors. So there's a map that tells where each one of those tiny, tiny little, I believe it's an iron oxide substrate that is magnetized or not magnetized. So it knows it's a 0 or 1 in that particular place, and that's how it reads and writes information from there. Yes, as you can see, bits on a sector. Yeah, so there's a map of a platter showing how data is captured there. So this is an old mechanical hard drive, not necessarily old in that chances are most computers are still using these, but they're not the most modern. So here are the different parts. The platters, there will definitely be more than 2. Power connection, the spindle, the read-write head, and the actuator arm. So you can see there how many things there are to go wrong. You've heard about hard drive mechanical function. That's a very, very common and real thing. As you can see, there's a lot of very delicate parts there, and it would not be very hard at all for them to completely just die and stop working. So flash memory that will definitely continue. As the prices on that become down, more and more hard drives, more and more of everything will be flash. Solid state is the term I was groping for. Solid state. Non-removable hard disk. Duh, most of these hard drives are non-removable. An external hard disk is obviously, I'm sure you guys probably already have one of these. It's a hard drive outside of your computer, therefore it's external. And then RAID is for that critical information that you absolutely cannot lose. A RAID backup drive actually stores your backup on 2 different hard drives at the same time. So it backs up all of your information onto 2 different disks at the same time. However, it's a little bit awkward in that if one of those hard drives goes down, then you can't retrieve your information. So it's kind of a strange thing. I guess it's much more safe, but because of the way it indexes the files, if you lose one of the 2 hard drives in that 2 hard drive system, you're still out of luck. But a redundant array of independent disks. So RAID is for backing stuff up. On a bigger level, for a CD, this is how information is stored and retrieved from a CD. When you burn a CD, little tiny grooves and etches are created underneath of the CD, and so lasers, when the laser shines on the CD, the laser is either reflected back into the laser mechanism or it's not, and that's how it knows that it's found either a 0 or a 1. So as you can see here, it has a land, which I'm not sure which one. If the light strikes back, it's reflected. Okay, so a pit would be a 0 and the light's not reflected back. And then the land would be that the laser is reflected back. Optical discs, information that's written and read with a laser, such as a CD, DVD, CDRW, which is rewritable, DVD, DVD-R, which is a recordable DVD, and then we have RW, which is rewritable, and then DVD-RAM, which is a format that nobody really uses. Blu-ray is, I think it's probably going to become like the redheaded stepchild, in that Mac has said we're never going to have Blu-ray support in Macs because it's just kind of like a stepping stone technology to the next big thing, which is probably nothing at all. You know what I mean? So Blu-rays hold a lot of data, except that it's so much like the DVD and presumed to be so much like the technology that'll be after it. There's really no reason to even upgrade to Blu-ray. Flash and solid state storage, we've definitely already talked about all this now. It doesn't have any moving parts, and therefore is much more secure. It doesn't have any of those mechanical and hardware functions. My wife gives me a hard time sometimes because I will bring home USB thumb drives, 8 gigs, 16 gigs, whatever, and I'll leave them in my pants pockets, and they'll get washed in the washer, and they'll still work. I defy you to put a mechanical hard drive into the washer and see if it still works afterwards. But a flash drive will still work after that. Try it out if you don't believe me. Smart card is a more safe and faster way for your wife to spend your money. You can read about that on your own if you'd like to. And then finally, we talked about online secondary storage, which was my example was iCloud, but there's a lot of other non-Apple storage solutions for that, like Google Drive. If you upload it to the cloud, you can then download it anywhere, anytime. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your kind attention today. I had a great time talking to you about these technologies. Please remember that you will be responsible for all of this information on a future quiz, and I look forward to seeing you online for our next chapter. Goodbye.